Imagine. It's the winter of 1941. The world is gripped by the most devastating war in history. Nazi Germany, riding on the wave of countless victories, seems unstoppable. The Red Army is reeling, Soviet cities are falling, and Hitler's forces have begun their final push toward Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union. But wait, what if I told you that this moment was not the end, but the beginning of one of the most remarkable military turnarounds in history? What if I told you that against all odds, the Soviet Union would not only hold Moscow, but inflict the first major defeat on Hitler's war machine? This is the story of the Battle of Moscow, a battle where the fate of the world may very well have hung in the balance. Act 1: The Road to Moscow. To understand the battle for Moscow, we need to start earlier in 1941, with Operation Barbarossa. This was Hitler's grand plan to conquer the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched a massive surprise invasion against the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by 600,000 motor vehicles and 750,000 horses, smashed through Soviet defenses in a brutal assault. In the early months, German forces achieved astonishing victories. Soviet forces were caught unprepared, despite intelligence reports warning of the impending attack. Entire Soviet armies were encircled, and cities fell like dominoes. By the end of July 1941, the Germans had captured Smolensk, a key city just 400 kilometers from Moscow. It seemed like Moscow, the beating heart of the Soviet Union, was within Hitler's grasp. But the German high command was divided. Some of Hitler's top generals, like Walther von Brauchitsch, wanted to push directly toward Moscow, believing that taking the Soviet capital would break the will of the USSR. Others, like Franz Halder, head of the Army General Staff, agreed. They felt the capture of Moscow would deliver a knockout blow to the Soviet Union. But Hitler disagreed. For Hitler, Moscow was secondary. He believed the key to defeating the Soviet Union lay in its economic resources. In his mind, controlling the vast resources of Ukraine and the oil-rich Caucasus would ensure a Nazi victory. So, instead of pressing on to Moscow, Hitler ordered his forces to divert north to Leningrad and south to Kiev. This was a decision that would buy Stalin and the Red Army precious time. Act 2: The Relentless Push toward Moscow. The summer offensive had bled the German army, but by September 1941, Hitler turned his sights back on Moscow. His forces had achieved major victories in Ukraine, capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, and now, he believed it was time to strike the Soviet capital. Operation Typhoon was launched on September 30, 1941. This was the code name for the German drive toward Moscow, a drive that Hitler expected would end the war by Christmas. His goal? Encircle and capture Moscow before winter truly set in. Hitler threw everything he had into the assault. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was reinforced with 2 million soldiers, nearly 2,500 tanks, and more than 1,400 aircraft. It was a fearsome fighting force, and the German blitzkrieg tactics, using fast-moving tank formations to encircle enemy forces, had already devastated Soviet defenses in earlier battles. But standing in their way were 3 Soviet fronts, the Western, Reserve, and Bryansk fronts, commanded by Marshal Semyon Timoshenko. The Soviets, though battered, were determined to defend Moscow. Stalin himself had made it clear, Moscow must not fall. For the Soviet people, Moscow was not just a city, it was a symbol of their very survival. Losing it would mean losing the war. The early days of the offensive were catastrophic for the Soviets. The Germans made rapid progress, and by mid-October, they had encircled and destroyed several Soviet armies near the cities of Vyazma and Bryansk. Nearly 700,000 Soviet troops were captured. The road to Moscow seemed wide open. But then, the weather turned. Act 3: The Russian winter arrives. As October gave way to November, the infamous Russian winter began to set in. For centuries, Russian winters had been a formidable ally, turning back invaders from Napoleon to the Mongols. Now, it would test the Germans like never before. The first snows began to fall on October 7th, and with them came Rasputitsa, Russia's dreaded mud season. The roads became impassable, and the Germans, whose blitzkrieg relied on speed and mobility, were suddenly bogged down. Tanks and trucks sank into the mud, supplies became scarce, and the Wehrmacht's advance slowed to a crawl. Still, the Germans pushed on. They captured Mozhaisk and approached the outer defenses of Moscow. By mid-November, German troops were less than 30 miles from the city. From some positions, German officers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But by now, Stalin had brought in one of his most trusted commanders, General Zhukov. Zhukov was a brilliant strategist, and he had a single goal: defend Moscow at all costs. Under Zhukov's direction, Moscow was transformed into a fortress. Thousands of civilians worked day and night to build trenches, lay mines, and construct barricades around the city. Meanwhile, Soviet factories were working around the clock to produce weapons. Civilians and soldiers alike knew that they were fighting for their lives. Act 4, the Siberian divisions. As winter set in, Hitler's forces were in for a rude awakening. They had been told that the war would be over by Christmas, and many German soldiers were still wearing their summer uniforms. But instead of victory, they faced a brutal Russian winter. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, and the Germans were unprepared. Vehicles froze, weapons malfunctioned, and frostbite became a greater enemy than the Red Army. But the Soviets were prepared. Thanks to Soviet intelligence, Stalin had learned that Japan had no intention of attacking the Soviet Union in the east. This allowed him to redeploy thousands of Siberian troops from the Far East to the Moscow front. These troops were well equipped for winter warfare, and they arrived just as the Germans were reaching their breaking point. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched its counteroffensive. The Germans, exhausted and frozen, were completely caught off guard. Soviet forces, led by the fresh Siberian divisions, attacked along a wide front. For the first time in the war, the Germans were forced to retreat. The Soviets pushed the Germans back over 100 miles from Moscow. Towns and villages that had been occupied by the Wehrmacht were liberated. German forces, which had seemed invincible just months before, were now in disarray. This was the turning point. The German blitzkrieg had been stopped. Moscow had not only survived, but the Red Army had delivered Hitler his first major defeat. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. Act 5, the battle's impact. The Battle of Moscow was a defining moment in World War II. It marked the first time that the German army had been decisively defeated, and it proved that the Soviet Union was far from beaten. More importantly, it shattered Hitler's dream of a quick victory in the East. The Soviet counteroffensive saved Moscow and demonstrated the resilience and determination of the Soviet people. This victory was a huge morale boost for the Soviet Union, and it became a symbol of Soviet resistance against the Nazi invaders. Moscow was awarded the title of Hero City in 1965, in recognition of the sacrifices made to defend it. But the significance of this battle wasn't just about Moscow. The German failure to capture the Soviet capital had far-reaching consequences. It marked the beginning of a long, brutal struggle on the Eastern Front, a front that would eventually see the complete collapse of the Nazi regime. For the German army, the failure at Moscow was a psychological blow. Hitler had promised his troops that they would be home by Christmas. Instead, they were now facing the prospect of a long, grinding war in a country that was far larger and more resilient than they had anticipated. For the Soviets, the battle was proof that they could stand up to the Nazi war machine. It marked the beginning of a series of Soviet offensives that would eventually push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. Act 6, the human cost of the battle. The Battle of Moscow wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a battle of wills, and it was fought by millions of ordinary people, soldiers, civilians, men, women, and even children. Take the story of Private Ivan Karpov, a young soldier from Siberia. He had never been to Moscow before the war, but he found himself defending the city with his life. Like many soldiers, Ivan was ill-equipped for the harsh winter, yet he fought on, his resolve fueled by the knowledge that if Moscow fell, so too would his homeland. On the German side, soldiers like Hans Müller faced a different kind of enemy. After months of triumph, Hans and his comrades were now struggling just to survive the cold. Many of them believed they were invincible until the frozen Russian landscape turned against them. For Hans, Moscow became the graveyard of his comrades' hopes of a quick victory. But it wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. Civilians in Moscow lived through months of terror as bombs rained down on the city. Factories were converted into military production, and entire families worked day and night to provide supplies for the front. Act 7, The Legacy of the Battle of Moscow. The legacy of the Battle of Moscow is still felt today. It was the first time that Hitler's forces had been stopped in their tracks, and it showed the world that the Soviet Union was a force to be reckoned with. The battle also served as a warning to the Axis powers: conquering the Soviet Union would be no easy feat. To this day, the defense of Moscow is commemorated annually with a parade in Red Square. The soldiers who fought in the battle are remembered as heroes, and the city itself has become a symbol of Soviet, and now Russian, resilience. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest battles.